In the summer of 2022, dealers moved in silence through the streets of Chesterfield and Sheffield. Their network ran like a machine, cars on the move, packages in hand, phones that never rang twice. At the top were men who lived modestly on paper, but behind closed doors, they were moving Class A drugs worth millions. This wasn't a corner shop operation. It was a regional drug line, rooted in Derbyshire, but stretching into Yorkshire and beyond. Over 20 suspects worked around the clock, some delivering, some collecting, others laundering the money. The setup was disciplined, profitable, and dangerous. For months, detectives from the East Midlands Special Operations Unit tracked every move. They watched deals go down in alleys, park benches, and petrol stations. They intercepted phones, tailed vehicles, and slowly mapped a drug empire built on cocaine, cash, and control. By the time police moved in, they'd seized nearly £1.2 million in cash, almost 20 kilos of cocaine, and even a loaded handgun. The arrests came fast, 17 gang members in total. Their trial would reveal a level of coordination and ruthlessness rarely seen outside major cities. This is the story of the line that fed a region, and the operation that brought it crashing down. It started like most drug lines do, quietly. A few calls here, a few drops there. But over time, this network became something else entirely. By 2022, the operation running through Chesterfield and Sheffield had grown into a full-scale drug enterprise, shifting kilos of cocaine and thousands of pounds in cash every week. What made this network different wasn't just the volume, it was how smoothly it all ran. At the center were men like Jake Roderick and Leon Wagstaff. Roderick wasn't just a dealer, he was the one pulling strings. With connections across the Midlands, he arranged shipments, managed runners, and kept the money flowing. He wasn't flashy, but he was careful. Phones were swapped regularly, routes were changed, and cash was laundered through fake businesses or handed off to trusted couriers. Wagstaff, meanwhile, played a key part in getting the drugs into circulation. Based in Brymington, he worked alongside Roderick to distribute cocaine across Derbyshire and South Yorkshire. From flats to alleyways, from parked cars to pubs, the handovers were constant. Their method was simple: stay fast, stay quiet, and never let the heat build in one place for too long. But even with their caution, police were watching. Undercover officers and surveillance teams from the East Midlands Special Operations Unit started gathering evidence in mid-2022. They tracked calls, followed vehicles, and began to map out the structure of the group. It became clear that this wasn't just a few friends selling to mates. It was a hierarchy: runners on the street, managers in the middle, and at the top, people like Roderick calling the shots. Over months, detectives watched as drugs moved between Sheffield and Chesterfield almost daily. Cocaine was the main product, but cannabis and heroin moved too, depending on the area and demand. And it wasn't just local sales. Cash from the operation was being moved around the UK. In one traffic stop in Sheffield, police recovered over £680,000 from a single vehicle. Another search found nearly £1.2 million in total. This was money that couldn't be explained away. And it pointed to one thing: serious organised crime. The group took steps to protect themselves. Coded messages were used. Burner phones never lasted more than a few weeks. Vehicles were often swapped or hired under false names. And there were weapons too. A handgun was recovered during the investigation, a clear sign that the gang was willing to defend their trade if it came to it. But with each deal, each call, and each drive across town, they were leaving a trail. One that police were following with patience and precision. They didn't move too early. They wanted it all: the drugs, the cash, and the names behind them. By the end of the year, they had it. The scale of the operation only became clear once police started kicking in doors. This wasn't just about big players. This was a network that stretched deep into communities, running through estates, cul-de-sacs, and corner shops. The line ran straight through Chesterfield and Sheffield, but its routes went wider, pulling in dozens of people from both cities. Some were well known in their areas. Others kept a low profile, blending into day-to-day life. But they all had a role to play. Dealers, drivers, stash householders, each person helped keep the line alive, serving customers, and keeping the product moving. On the ground, it looked almost normal. Phones buzzing, people meeting briefly in parked cars or alleyways, cash changing hands quickly and quietly. The drugs, mainly cocaine, weren't cut on sight. They were brought in already prepared for distribution, packed in bulk and ready to split. Some parcels were stashed in flats. Others were hidden in cars or passed between gang members in fast-moving handovers. Police say thousands of street deals were carried out during the course of the operation, with customers ranging from casual users to regular addicts, all feeding a trade that never slowed down. But it wasn't just drugs being moved. Cash flowed just as fast, thousands disappearing up and down the country. In interviews, residents described how obvious the dealing had become. "You'd see the same people coming and going all day," one neighbor said. "Cars pulling up, people leaning in, and then they'd be off again. It was constant." Despite this, fear kept many quiet. People knew what the group was capable of, and they didn't want trouble on their doorstep. Some of the men arrested during the raids had already been on the police radar. Others, like Bradley Cocking and Mahad Hibbett, had kept a lower profile until now. But once the net tightened, names began to surface fast. Associates flipped, phones were analyzed, conversations were decoded. The picture became clearer. This was a professional, highly structured operation built to make money, fast, dangerous, and without care for the damage it left behind. And the damage was real. Addiction, violence, fear. Areas that were already struggling found themselves at the mercy of a drug line that didn't care who it sold to or what the fallout looked like. For the gang, this was business. For everyone else, it was chaos in disguise. By the end of 2022, the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, EMSOU, had seen enough. Patterns were forming, numbers didn't lie. Too many familiar names, too many handovers, and far too much cash for it to be coincidence. They launched a covert operation targeting the suspected supply line feeding Chesterfield and Sheffield. The goal: map the web, find the top, and shut it down. The operation began quietly. Officers watched from a distance. Cars were followed, meetings logged, numbers traced. Surveillance teams worked around the clock, keeping eyes on known suspects and using unmarked vehicles to shadow them across city streets and motorways. But this wasn't just about watching. It was about gathering evidence that would stand up in court. They deployed undercover officers, used drone footage, and tapped into encrypted phone networks. Crucially, detectives were able to link burner phones to certain gang members by tracking when and where those devices were active. If a drug drop was happening in Sheffield at 10 a.m. and the same burner pinged off a Derby mast 2 hours later, police were building a picture, one call, one move at a time. The network was slick, but mistakes were made. Phones were seized and data extracted. The contents revealed coded language, drop locations, and payments. Group chats tied together names that hadn't previously appeared on police radar. Bank accounts showed sudden deposits, too large, too frequent, and impossible to explain with legitimate work. As the pressure built, some suspects started to crack. A few confessed quickly. Others tried to deny involvement, but the paper trail was too long, the evidence too tight. One of the gang, Jake Roderick, stood out early. Already on the radar, he had links to multiple members and a string of messages tying him to deals, cash pickups, and even access to a firearm. The team also recovered weapons during their raids, including a handgun and ammunition. While the gun wasn't brandished during the drug activity, its presence told police all they needed to know. This wasn't just a group trying to make money, it was a gang prepared to defend its territory with lethal force if necessary. Inspector Tom Bly, who led the operation, later said, "They thought they were untouchable. They moved quietly, but we moved quieter. We had our eyes on them for months, and when the time came, we didn't miss." The trap had been laid. The pieces were in place. And what had once looked like a ghost network was now a long list of names, faces, and charges. With months of surveillance under their belt and a mountain of evidence ready to go, officers moved in. The takedown was precise. In coordinated raids across Chesterfield, Sheffield, and beyond, police executed warrants in the early hours, before suspects could run, destroy phones, or hide drugs. It was a show of force that left no doubt the operation was over. Across multiple properties, they seized large quantities of heroin and cocaine, both wrapped for distribution and stacked for supply. Hidden compartments were found behind skirting boards, in loft spaces, and inside fake air vents. In one property, officers uncovered a trapdoor in the kitchen floor that led to a stash of drugs and cash. Elsewhere, in a modest-looking semi-detached house, they discovered more than £200,000 in notes boxed up beside kilos of Class A substances. The arrests were just as widespread. Some suspects went quietly, already resigned to what was coming. Others tried to bluff their way out, claiming ignorance or denying everything. But with tracking data, text messages, phone calls, and physical surveillance all pointing in the same direction, denials didn't last long. Many of those arrested were known to each other, connected by family ties or long-standing associations. But some names came as surprises. Individuals who had managed to stay under the radar until now. Detectives found that while the operation appeared tightly controlled from above, it relied on dozens of runners, packers, and lower-level dealers to function. From the top to the street-level sellers, nearly every link in the chain had been touched. The most striking element of the raids wasn't the violence. It was the calm. There were no standoffs or shootouts. The gang had moved quietly for so long that when the door finally came down, they had no idea how much trouble they were already in. The image of strength they tried to maintain dissolved as evidence piled up on the living room floor. Over the following weeks, further arrests were made. Cash was counted. More burner phones were examined. In total, the operation uncovered nearly £1.2 million in criminal profits, most of it in cash, with more suspected to have moved offshore or through laundering fronts. The East Midlands Special Operations Unit had dismantled a regional drug empire that had stretched across counties and funneled misery into communities for years. The scale was stunning, but so was the success of the investigation. And now, with charges filed and court dates set, the final phase was about to begin. As the defendants filed into the courtroom at Derby Crown Court, the weight of the case against them was clear. The gallery was filled with journalists, detectives, and quietly anxious family members. 17 men and women stood accused of being part of a sophisticated drug conspiracy that had funneled vast amounts of Class A drugs, mainly cocaine and heroin, into communities across Sheffield and Chesterfield. The prosecution had more than just drugs and cash. They had phone records, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and intercepted messages from encrypted devices. The case was airtight. 13 of the defendants, faced with overwhelming evidence, pleaded guilty before the trial even began. The remaining 7 chose to fight the charges. But after weeks of argument and cross-examination, a jury found them guilty. Each defendant had played a different role in the network. At the top was Jake Roderick, who not only helped control the flow of drugs but also coordinated laundering operations to disguise the profits. The court heard that he operated with impunity, directing others while distancing himself from the physical transactions. His use of encrypted phones and coded messages was deliberate, designed to shield him from police scrutiny. But it hadn't worked. Others like Leon Wagstaff and Torrington Smith were heavily involved in street-level supply, moving drugs between stash houses and trusted contacts. Meanwhile, men like Bradley McCarthy and Luke Mills handled packaging, cash collection, and logistics. Their homes doubled as storage units, with rooms converted into counting areas and processing stations. Some even used family members to hide or move the drugs, dragging innocent people into their criminal enterprise. One of the most revealing moments came when footage was shown of £680,000 being recovered from a single vehicle. The court watched in silence as officers opened compartments stuffed with banknotes, bagged and rubber-banded, ready for laundering. It wasn't just the scale that shocked, it was the casualness. This was routine for the gang. Judge Sean Smith KC made it clear that the court viewed the operation as dangerous and corrosive. He said the network had spread poison through communities already vulnerable to addiction and violence. The sentences, he warned, would reflect not just the damage done, but the arrogance of those who believed they could get away with it. One by one, the gang members were led from the dock to the cells, each with years, in some cases decades, of prison time ahead. But the biggest message came not from the jail terms themselves, but from what came next. By the time sentencing came around in early 2025, the scale of the operation was undeniable. This was not a loose network of dealers. It was a well-oiled supply line, rooted in organization, backed by serious money and protected by violence. And the courts treated it as such. Jake Roderick, identified as one of the key figures behind the network, received a sentence of 16 years. His conviction wasn't just for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, but also for possession of a firearm and laundering criminal proceeds. Judge Sean Smith KC told the court that Roderick's involvement wasn't peripheral. He was directing the show. The firearm, he said, made it clear that the group was prepared to protect their profits with deadly force. Leon Wagstaff was handed a 9-year, 4-month sentence, while Torrington Smith received 6 years and 8 months. Others, including Bradley Cocking, Luke Mills, and Kyle Rayworth, were given terms ranging from 5 to nearly 8 years. Even those further down the ladder, runners, handlers, couriers, faced jail time, with sentences between 4 and 6 years. In total, more than 100 years of jail time were handed out across 17 people. 7 of them had tried to deny the charges but were convicted by juries. The judge said their continued denials had only added to the length of their sentences. The figures were stark: almost 20 kilograms of cocaine and heroin recovered, £1.2 million in seized cash, and links to other operations still under investigation. But what mattered most to the communities of Sheffield and Chesterfield wasn't just the weight or the money. It was the promise that people feeding addiction and chaos into their neighborhoods were finally being removed from the streets. Inspector Tom Blythe, who led the investigation, described it as one of the most significant crackdowns in recent years. This was a group with reach, he said. They had structure, discipline, and confidence. They thought they were untouchable. Today, they found out otherwise. He added that many of those sentenced had built entire lifestyles around their profits, buying expensive cars, designer clothes, and living well beyond their means. Now they'll be living very differently, he said, and that sends a message. But there's a bigger question hanging in the air. How many more networks like this are still out there? For every drug line shut down, another waits to fill the space. The demand hasn't gone away, and as long as there's profit in poison, someone will try to sell it. The collapse of this network was a major win for law enforcement, but the war continues. And for the communities still battling the impact of drugs, that war is far from over.